The three things I gave when I wrote The Savage Wars of Peace, um, comparing Japan and England,
Mm.
testing out Malthus's theories, basically. When you're testing Malthus's theories of why the demography of these two, Japan and England, are so different, what you have to look at are basically the variables he looked at. And those are what he called the positive checks. Those are the ones which act on death rates. And he isolated war, famine, and disease. And then the negative checks, which act on fertility, which is contraception and so on. Now, the three positive checks: war, famine, and disease. So my book starts with a consideration of war and famine. And then the rest of the book is basically about disease. So from that time onwards, I became, and perhaps before, I became very interested in these three phenomena and wrote extensively in that book, and then a bit in other places, about war, famine, and disease. And when we ran a joint paper with biological anthropologists and archaeologists, and they said, who would like to do something on strategies of survival, I said I would be happy to do that, because these are strategies of survival. How do you deal with these three horsemen of the apocalypse? So, and I gave a series of lectures on war as well. So taking those three and starting with war, I discovered, by looking at the anthropology of war, a number of things which sort of surprised me and are interesting. One is the question of whether human beings are naturally warlike, which is how I often started off the lectures. Are we a warlike species or a peaceful species? This is back to Rousseau and Hobbes and so on. And the answer is that we're both. That is to say, anthropologists can come up, as they do, all societies are warlike, and then anthropologists pick out of their card pack, oh no, not the so-and-sos. And you can have not the so-and-sos. There are certain small hunting gathering groups in the Pacific who are extremely peaceful. The moment they hear the click of a weapon, they're off. They don't have weapons, they don't have the ideas of war at all. And when the West encountered them, they found these peaceful people living in often very small groups in remote forests, and they weren't warlike at all. And hunters and gatherers in many societies are quite peaceful. They don't fight against each other, often because the bands are very dispersed. But what they found, hunter-gatherer studies started to find, was that if you looked at early remains of hunting and gathering groups back thousands of years, they often ended their lives in a nasty and brutal accident caused by another human being. So there were quite high homicide rates in hunter-gatherer bands in Australia and Africa. And so even there, it's a mixed picture. Certainly, if you go to, above all, forested tribal groups, they are usually very warlike, particularly in the Amazon. The Amazon, people like Chagnon, Napoleon Chagnon, write books called The Fierce People and so on, which are about the battles that are fought between the Yanomami and other groups and so on. And the same in New Guinea, and the same in many parts of the Pacific and in Africa. These are, their manhood is derived from strength of war. It's a constant battle between small subgroups. And this is why the Nagas, who are another example of this, much of their art is put into war. Their war dances, their spears, I have some in my house. War is, as it were, for the Nagas, what the economy is for the Americans. It is the purpose of life, because it's a Darwinian competitive world where if you don't protect yourself, the next village will. eliminate you or take your wives or whatever. So the answer to the question of whether human beings are naturally warlike or not is that it depends. There are examples of both, but basically, as every child, school child knows, you have to be able to defend yourself because other human beings will take advantage of you if you don't. So either at the private level or the band or tribe level. Now, in the lectures, you then get to the stage of dividing tribal war into two kinds. There's those forested dwellers who build up huge surpluses and then they use them to produce war dances and feasts, and they fight against each other and so on and so on. But it's almost like games of rugby. You know, you would go for several years and then you would have a fight against another tribe and so on. So it's intermittent feuding. It's a form of feud. And the other kind is the people who keep animals. That's North African herders, the people who Ernest Gellner worked with in Morocco and in the Middle East, in that whole band right across Afghanistan and the Middle East is where you find feuding societies. Now, the word feud comes from the Scots, and the deadly feud is what the Scots did. My ancestors, the Macfarlanes, went out and they marauded on other clans nearby and stole their cattle and their wives or whatever it was. And so if you have cattle or sheep herding groups in a territory, very often they are very warlike. And so many of the best studies of feuding have been done in the Middle East, Black Micho on feuding societies and so on. And the greatest concentration of feuding is basically in the Albanian, Bosnian, Montenegrin area, that area of northern Greece, and that area, some of the classic works often by women who can get into these. Two of the great anthropologists of feud are women anthropologists, Margaret Hasluck and Edith Durham. They've written two of the great books on feuding because they don't get killed. They can go in from village to village. And so feuding was a big subject in anthropology, and it's all about mutually assured destruction. And it leads to the vendetta, that if they take blood from you, you have to take blood from them. So feuding, vendetta, that is the world basically of animal herding societies. Honor and shame, vendetta, feud.
So these are the big machismo societies, aren't they? These are...
So this is my ancestors up to the British arriving and pacifying them all.
Civilizing
you. So basically, that's what you get. And then you move finally to war. And war is something very much associated with some entity, a state. So these are entities which now have taxation, they have professional training, they have a body of people who fight wars. They may be there all the time, standing armies, or they may be recruited. And so you have a fixed boundary, which you wouldn't have in these other kinds of places where they're fluid boundaries. You have a fixed boundary. We're on this side, you're on that side, and we will attack you and hope to the usual motives of war, either to get your territory or to get your wealth or loot you or just have a good time. So war has been a central preoccupation of civilized state-like imperial societies from some thousands of years ago, from the Egyptians onwards, and you'd find it in China and Rome and so on. And it's a perennial activity that has lasted and lasts up to the present. And we don't know how to deal with it, and we don't know how to end it, and we don't know how to control it. And the wars have got more and more dangerous because the weapons have developed, and there's a huge transition once you get gunpowder weapons and the possibility of mass killing, and then the tragedies of the First World War and the Second World War.
Mm.
So war is now a total disaster, as it's always been a disaster, but now no one is free from it. And therefore, and since it's also a huge money spinning activity, one of the problems of capitalism is, of course, that you have to have some way of destroying, as with the simplest society, you have to have some way of destroying wealth and artifacts in order to justify you making new ones. And what better way than war? So, many of the richest corporations, I mean, the British economy would collapse overnight if we stopped exporting weapons, which is our main export, and so on and so on. So basically, it's intertwined with the military and industrial complex, and therefore the chances of getting rid of it, it goes against huge vested interests. And it goes against the instinct, the Clausewitz instinct, that if we make a concession, they'll just come and attack us first. So basically, warfare has been mounting and mounting and mounting. And as I've said elsewhere, some societies are more. The British got the best of all things, which is that they had total constant wars almost all the time for the last 1,000 years, but not on their own territory. They went and fought on other people's territory. And so they got the spoils of war without the cost of war. Unfortunate places like France and Germany and elsewhere were constantly. Another thing to say about war, I mean, when I mentioned gunpowder, which isn't, that there was a tipping point. The great warlike powers, which were the threat to Europe, were the Mongols and the desert peoples, or the open peoples of Central Eurasia. And they were to be feared, and even North Africa, until efficient gunpowder weapons in the 18th century. And that's when it was tipped, and people who had the money had the technology. So the beginnings of gunpowder weapons and industrialism in the West tipped the balance between East and West to a large extent in that way. The last thing to mention is there was a man called J.U. Neff. His surname was Neff, who wrote a book on war. He also wrote a book on coals and the Industrial Revolution. He argued that we have gotten more civilized, that basically human beings have learnt something from history, and they are less cruel and less inclined to go, that from the Renaissance onwards, they began to realize the downside of war, and they began to behave in a more thoughtful, even kind way. And this was the Neff thesis, that wars will die out through the civilizing process, which Norbert Elias talks about. We will become civilized at last. Now, I cannot think what delusion led him to this. The facts fly in the face of it. There is no evidence that our leaders are less inclined to go to war than leaders in the past. There is no evidence that you or I are less prone to support war than our predecessors. Any reform to this, which is obviously absolutely desperately needed, it's not going to arise out of some natural tendency in humans to become more loving and kind and thoughtful and read more books and other things like that. Civilized people will go and kill other people, as we know. Tony Blair was not an uncivilized or uneducated person, and he did more harm than almost any living human being by joining in that war. So we've got to think
Bush too, as well, I suppose. I mean,
Sorry?
what I was reading about
Bush as well, yes.
Bush too. I mean, as a person, he seems a lot more civilized, if you like, not than say Trump. But actually, in terms of the war, he was much worse than Trump.
Much worse, much worse. I mean, that's the one good thing about Trump.
Yeah.
He wasn't keen on wasting money. And so, he didn't not get involved in these wars because he was opposed to it, but it was just a waste of good money.
I'm
Now,
wondering whether that's a clue to where if the issue of war, the big problem of war, should we be then making things like competitive sport A, more serious, and B, much more expensive, have lots of more paraphernalia so that you can almost generate economies round sport and sporting activities and this kind of thing, which can be just as competitive but not as lethal.
that's a very good idea. And the Americans have done this already, of course, because a lot of their competitive sports require much more equipment
Hmm.
than ours. Um, I mean, Churchill famously said "jaw jaw," not "war war." Um, but I can't think of something that rhymes with war. But say play play instead of. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, in the anti-Iraq protests, they had slogans: "Make tea, not make war," and "make games." Games are a very good, as schools realize, a good way of channeling energy and aggression. I mean, it's not really aggression. Because that's another thing I forgot to say about war. War is not necessarily about individual aggression. The generals and the people who start wars are not necessarily very unpleasant or aggressive people. My family were army officers, many of them. My grandfather was the most gentle, kindly, poetry loving, sort of gardening sort of grandfather, but he was a lieutenant colonel and he would go out and shoot people if necessary. My uncle, who was in the brigade of Gurkhas and Wingate's raiders. I mean, he's a very gentle Christian, but he shot Japanese and so on if ordered. And the Gurkhas I worked with were the most peaceful and loving people in their villages. But when they joined the Gurkha regiments and were ordered to fight and kill, they did. So war is not about individual aggression necessarily, though sometimes it is. But if there was some way of looking at what military production does in terms of our industries and thinking of a way, I mean, it's very simple. You say, okay, don't do that, put it into green energy, make the world a green energy space. I mean, you know, Boris Johnson tomorrow could sit down and say all the money that's being, each year, 10% of what's being spent on weapons development will be put into, it would change overnight. I mean, it's easy peasy, but they won't.